Hey, how's it going over there? Hey, you want to see our poster? If you see any poster at this conference, you got to see this one. It'll change your life. It'll change the very research you do in your lab when you have lab meeting next Monday. Okay, great. Yeah, glad you have the patience and curiosity to see this radical new idea. Hello, I'm Tim Marzullo. That's me on the left.
And I'm Greg Gage, and that's me on the right.
And our third co-author, Hirak Parek, is down there at the bottom. He couldn't be here with us today because he's presenting another poster.
The poster we want to present is the singular theory of unification, and that is the singular cortex does everything.
Now, this sounds like a very radical theory to you, but let us walk you through it carefully. So when I did my first experiments in grad school, what I was doing was studying a cingulate cortex as kind of an alternative site for a neuroprosthetic model. But as I started doing background reading on the cingulate cortex, I noticed some rather astonishing things.
One of the things we found was that classically, the cingulate cortex was found to be involved in detecting errors, or things that you think have gone wrong.
So when you're playing a game and you make a mistake, the cingulate cortex will become active, and this was shown through EEG recordings here at Michigan, actually.
Another thing was done was stimulus reward, or classic Pavlovian conditioning, involves the cingulate cortex.
Also, sleep. If you fall asleep, the cingulate cortex neurons increase their firing rate.
So what we have here is a sleeping elephant that's now, but what's going to happen in the future?
Yeah, when that elephant grows up. Keep that in mind. We'll get to that in a few slides.
Some classic monkey physiology shows that reward-based motor planning, so when you're playing a slot machine and you think that you're not actually getting good rewards on this one, you might want to switch to another one. The cingulate cortex is involved with that motor plan to switch over to another one.
Not only involved, but responsible. And reward expectancy, some work at the NIH by Shadar and Richmond in 2002, that if you simply have a task where you modulate the probability of reward, the cingulate cortex will follow those probabilities rather nicely.
With the advent of fMRI, or functional magnetic resonant imaging, we can actually take and probe the human brain to figure out how the human brains are involved in various tasks. And what they found is that there's very high-level cognitive things that are involving the cingulate cortex. For example, the placebo effect. If you take something that you think is going to get yourself better, you actually become better. It's a true effect, and that actually involves your cingulate cortex.
And pain perception, that people who have fibromyalgia have problems with the opioid signal in their cingulate cortex. Now, both of these, placebo and pain perception, are actually done by colleagues here at the University of Michigan.
So another thing that you can look at is if you're a liberal person, you actually have a higher activation of your cingulate cortex versus a conservative colleague.
And if you play a game with other people and then those other people gang up on you and decide to exclude you from the game and become socially excluded, aka lonely, the cingulate cortex lights up in that task.
And even very recently, even a few days before we presented our poster, they found that if you have an optimistic thought, if you're feeling of optimism, your cingulate cortex is engaged at that particular point.
So it seems that the cingulate is involved in all these things, and how can we kind of combine all these functions to one framework that's easily understood? So what we have here is our theory, which attempts to do that, which we call the singular theory of unification, which is
the cingulate cortex does everything.
And we should devote our energies not onto determining what the cingulate does,
but how it actually does do it.
Because we had noticed an alarming trend, which we'll now show to you.
So now we're actually looking at real data. This is data that we collected from PubMed, which is a popular citation index database, which looks at all the peer-reviewed journals that have been out there in the medical field. And so what we've done, we've wrote 3 queries that looked at, inside the abstract or in the title, 3 areas of the cortex. We've looked at cingulate cortex, auditory cortex, and motor cortex. And we've plotted them as a function of time, how many articles had referenced one of these 3 areas in there.
And so if you look at motor and auditory, you notice that they increase in the late 60s. We hypothesize that this is most probably due to the advent of extracellular unit recordings. But if you look at the cingulate, it doesn't really appear to have that many publications until this breakpoint around the 90s, right when fMRI started coming into its own. And you can see it skyrockets.
And actually, if you almost look at the year 2007, which was last year, the cingulate cortex actually overtakes the mighty motor cortex.
And so we're scientists. We like to model things. What can we do with this data?
So one thing we can do is fit it to a exponential curve. And so when you do that, you can actually do a statistical test to see how well your data fits your model. And so what we've done is shown 3 models here for our exponential growing curves. And what you see is your R-squared value tells you how good your data actually fits. And what we get is for the cingulate cortex in blue, we get an R-squared value of 0.97, and that's pretty spectacular, isn't it, Tim?
Yeah, on my data, I usually get R-squared values like 0.6 or 0.5. What do you get?
Yeah, I actually get right around there because for biological data, it's really hard to find things that actually fit this well to a model.
And so the motor cortex fits at 0.9, which is pretty good, and auditory at 0.59.
So things are growing, but not as well as the cingulate cortex is growing.
And with an R-squared value of 0.97, we feel that we can become prophets in a sense and actually try to attempt to model the future.
So yeah. So when we do that, when we take a look at this plot, we're very conservative in our estimates. We have a pretty good R-squared value. So we're just going to look 20 years in the future. When we do that, we see an alarming trend.
What we see is that by the year 2027, the rate of cingulate publications will have increased 15-fold. Whereas auditory and motor will only be 1.5 to 3. Now, this is still okay. 2,000 publications in motor, you can still go to your conferences and have fun. But you can interpret this data in a variety of ways, though.
Yeah, one way you can look at it is like, where do you want to be? Do you want to be on that blue line, or do you want to be on the red line or the yellow line? Because one way you can look at it is that maybe it's good, because that way there'd be a lot of funding come into the cingulate cortex, and maybe you want to switch over to start studying the cingulate cortex because the NIH and the NSF are all going to be looking at that type of area to do research in.
Or the alternative is that you just want to be a face in the crowd. In the sea of cingulate cortex publications and posters at a conference, you'll be the one person studying NMDA receptors. But there's more.
This is the alarming trend. And what you see, is predicted it out for another 100 years. And what you see is that we had to plot this data on a logarithmic plot because the data was so big that it just wouldn't fit on the computer.
Yes, and actually, if you look closely, between the year 2050 and the year 2100, there will be more cingulate cortex publications than there are actual cells in the cingulate cortex.
So what's going to happen, do you think, at that
I think at that happen, the singularity is going to be reached. Ray Kurzweil's singularity, that the cingulate cortex will become self-aware. Self-aware people. Now, the cingulate cortex may decide to use its powers for good or evil.
But what if it uses its powers for evil? That's what we need to be careful about.
I mean, if it's good, then that's good. We shouldn't worry. But if it's evil, then humankind might be in danger. So that's why we're saying we should devote all our energies and skills into studying how the cingulate does all that it does. So when the singularity is actually reached, we are prepared.
So what you're saying is we could actually prevent this from happening.
We might be able to prevent it if we actually try to understand how the cingulate cortex works and not what it does. Okay, so that's the end of our presentation, but we also want to make kind of a homage to Franz Gall because we feel he's been unfairly treated in the neuroscience field. He was one of the founders of the idea of functional localization in the brain, that small parts of the brain can do very distinct things. This later grew into phrenology, where you could determine a person's personality based on bumps of the skull. But his fundamental idea that you could have a small part of the brain doing a specific thing, or in our hypothesis, everything, we have to give props to the godfather, Franz Gall.
And so one thing we didn't mention was that the cingulate cortex was named by German physiologists in the 18th century. Was it 19th century?
It was 18th century.
Okay. One thing we didn't mention was that the German physiologists in the 18th century that...
No, it was 19th, actually.
Yes.
Okay. All right, let's go.
So one thing we forgot to mention was that when the cingulate cortex was discovered by German physiologists in the 19th century, they named it after a cingulum, which the Latin word means a belt. And it was a belt that was worn by Roman legionnaires to sort of protect their groins. And they actually couldn't have chose a more apropos word.
Because the cingulate truly lives up to its name by being a belt that ties around all of humankind's fears, desires, loves, hates, ambitions, hungers into one cohesive framework. And if you look underneath the cingulum, what do you find, Greg?
You find the cingulate cortex.
That wee bit of brain that is responsible for so much. And so, consider yourself warned.
You have the information. It's only up to you what you do with it.
And now you know more than you did. Now you know more than you did.